Why no one escaped life inside ancient Rome's largest slave market. Boring history for sleep part 1 tonight. We're going to travel far from the modern world. Far from highways glowing beneath streetlights. Far from buzzing smartphones, crowded airports and cities that never truly sleep. Instead, we'll drift slowly across the calm waters of the Mediterranean Sea, where the sound of wooden ships gently creaking against the waves is one of the loudest noises you'll hear. Our destination is a tiny rocky island that once stood at the very center of the ancient world, an island so small that you could walk across much of it in only a few hours. Yet despite its modest size, nearly every major civilization around the Mediterranean knew its name. Merchants spoke about it, kings taxed it, pirates watched it, Roman senators invested fortunes there, and countless ordinary people arrived without ever choosing to come. Some arrived carrying silk, others carried wine. Others unloaded marble columns, bronze statues, fragrant spices, or heavy sacks of grain. But thousands arrived carrying nothing at all. Because they themselves were the cargo, tonight we'll slowly explore the remarkable and heartbreaking story of ancient Rome's largest slave market, not through battles or dramatic speeches, not through famous emperors or legendary generals. Instead, we'll follow the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. We'll discover how people lived, how merchants negotiated, how ships arrived every morning, how families were separated, how fortunes were made, and how an island dedicated to the gods quietly became one of history's busiest marketplaces for human lives. As always, take a slow breath, get comfortable, allow the modern world to fade gently into the background. Our story begins just before sunrise. The first light of dawn slowly spread across the eastern horizon. Long before the streets became crowded, fishermen were already awake. The sea was unusually calm. Tiny ripples reflected shades of pale blue, soft orange, and faint pink. Seabirds circled overhead, occasionally diving into the water before lifting back into the cool morning air. From a distance, the island of Delos appeared peaceful. White stone buildings rested quietly beneath rolling hills. Marble temples caught the first rays of sunlight. Narrow streets wound gently between homes, workshops, warehouses, and marketplaces. Nothing about the island suggested that it would soon become one of the busiest commercial centers in the Mediterranean. Nothing suggested that thousands of lives would change before sunset. Delos occupied a surprisingly strategic location. It sat almost perfectly within the Aegean Sea, ships traveling between Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, Italy, and the eastern Mediterranean naturally passed nearby. For merchants, it was almost impossible to ignore. For centuries, sailors stopped here to rest, trade, repair ships, and honor the island's sacred traditions. Because before Delos became famous for commerce, it was known for religion. According to Greek mythology, this small island was the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis. Pilgrims traveled from distant cities simply to visit its temples. The sanctuary attracted visitors from nearly every corner of the Greek world. Even powerful kings treated the island with great respect. Religious festivals filled the streets with music, prayers, sacrifices, and celebrations. For generations, Delos represented something peaceful, something sacred, something worthy of admiration. But history has a curious habit of changing the purpose of places, and Delos was no exception. Everything began to change during the 2nd century before Christ. Rome was expanding rapidly. Every successful military campaign brought wealth back to Italy. New provinces paid taxes. Trade routes expanded. Merchant fleets multiplied. The Roman Republic needed enormous quantities of food, building materials, metals, luxury goods, and labor, especially labor. Ancient economies depended heavily upon human work. Fields had to be harvested. Roads had to be constructed. Aqueducts required maintenance. Mines demanded workers willing or forced to spend endless hours underground. Large villas required cooks, gardeners, teachers, accountants, nurses, craftsmen, and servants. The richer Rome became, the greater its demand for enslaved workers. And where demand exists, markets inevitably follow. Delos soon transformed into something few people had imagined. Instead of serving primarily as a religious sanctuary, it became one of the greatest free ports in the Mediterranean. Taxes on trade remained remarkably low. Merchants loved this. Ships arrived from every direction. Business expanded at astonishing speed. Warehouses filled entire neighborhoods. Banks opened offices. Money changers sat behind polished wooden tables. Languages mixed together in every marketplace. Greek, Latin, Egyptian, Phoenician, Hebrew, Syriac, and dozens of regional dialects echoed through crowded streets. The island became astonishingly international. One merchant might purchase Spanish silver in the morning, sell Egyptian grain before lunch, negotiate for Syrian glass in the afternoon, and finance another voyage before sunset. Fortunes appeared almost overnight. Yet among all these ordinary goods, one commodity generated extraordinary profits: human beings. By sunrise, the harbor already bustled with activity. Dockworkers rolled barrels along wooden ramps, sailors tightened ropes. Officials recorded cargo, merchants shouted instructions. Pack animals carried supplies through narrow streets. Everything moved with remarkable efficiency. Roman commerce valued organization. Time mattered. Every delay cost money. A ship remaining in port one unnecessary day represented lost profit. Crews worked quickly. Cargo disappeared almost as soon as vessels docked. Olive oil, wine, marble, timber, copper, iron, spices, wool, pottery, everything found buyers. Everything had value, including people. From a distance, one arriving vessel looked almost identical to every other merchant ship. Its sails fluttered gently. Its hull creaked softly against the waves. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. Only as workers approached did the differences become clear. There were no stacked amphorae covering its deck, no large piles of timber, no cages filled with livestock. Instead, rows of frightened people waited quietly beneath armed guards. Some stared toward the shoreline, some kept their heads lowered. Others seemed too exhausted even to look around. Many had spent weeks crossing the sea. Some had survived battles, others had survived pirate attacks. Some had been captured while defending their villages. Others had been sold because their families could no longer survive famine or debt. Their stories differed. Their destination did not, the harbor of Delos. One by one, they slowly stepped onto the wooden dock. No one welcomed them, no musicians played, no families waited with flowers, only traders carrying notebooks, inspectors, guards, buyers, accountants. Everyone already knew why the ship had arrived. No introductions were necessary. No explanations were required. Business would begin soon. The morning air remained pleasantly cool. Sunlight slowly climbed higher above the surrounding hills. Shadows shortened across the stone streets. Shopkeepers opened heavy wooden shutters. Fresh bread emerged from neighborhood ovens. The smell drifted gently through nearby alleys. Children chased one another between fountains. Temple priests prepared morning offerings. For many residents, today seemed completely ordinary. Because it was. The arrival of slave ships no longer surprised anyone. It had become part of daily life. Just as predictable as sunrise, just as routine as merchants opening their shops, history often feels shocking when viewed from centuries away. Yet for those living through it, even extraordinary events gradually become ordinary, and nowhere demonstrated this truth more clearly than Delos. The marketplace slowly awakened as the morning sun climbed above the hills. Golden light spread across polished marble columns and limestone streets that countless feet had worn smooth over generations. The air remained cool for only a little while longer. By midday, the island would become hot enough that many merchants preferred to conduct their most important business during the early hours. Every minute mattered. A caravan of donkeys entered the market carrying baskets filled with figs, olives, onions, and fresh bread. Nearby, fishermen unloaded their night's catch onto stone tables. The smell of salt water mixed with herbs, olive oil, and smoke from small cooking fires. If you had arrived without knowing Delos' reputation, the island might have seemed like any prosperous Mediterranean trading town. You would have seen smiling merchants greeting familiar customers, children running through narrow streets, craftsmen carefully carving marble, women filling clay jars at public fountains, priests quietly sweeping the entrances to sacred temples. Life appeared calm, predictable, almost peaceful. Yet only a short walk away, another market was preparing to open. One unlike any other. It stood close enough to the harbor that newly arrived captives could be brought there without delay. Efficiency was everything. Roman merchants understood that feeding, housing, and guarding large groups of enslaved people cost money. The faster they could be sold, the greater the profit. Simple wooden platforms stood ready beneath large awnings that offered a little protection from the growing heat. Clerks arranged wax tablets and sharpened their styluses. Account books were opened. Scales were checked. Coins were counted. Nothing about the preparation suggested emotion. Everything resembled the beginning of another ordinary business day. Because to the traders, that was exactly what it was. Ancient Roman commerce depended upon careful organization. Successful merchants kept detailed financial records. They calculated transportation costs, storage fees, harbor charges, expected selling prices, potential risks, even weather forecasts mattered. A strong storm at sea could delay dozens of ships. A delayed shipment could reduce profits. Everything had a number attached to it. Everything except the hopes and fears carried by the people waiting behind the wooden fences. Those could not be measured. The captives waited quietly. Some spoke softly in languages that few people around them understood. Others remained silent. Many had lost family members during the long journey. Some had become separated only days earlier. Others no longer knew whether their loved ones were alive. No announcements explained what would happen next. There was no schedule posted on a wall. No comforting words. Only uncertainty. Roman buyers began arriving soon after sunrise. Some came alone. Others arrived with assistants carrying writing tablets. A wealthy landowner might be searching for workers capable of harvesting olives. A mining contractor needed strong laborers accustomed to physical work. A household manager wanted cooks, cleaners, or nurses. An educated Greek slave might become a tutor for wealthy Roman children. A skilled physician captured during war could earn an astonishingly high price. A talented musician might entertain guests during elaborate dinner parties. Not every enslaved person performed the same work. Roman society relied upon countless different skills. Education mattered. Languages mattered. Health mattered. Age mattered. Experience mattered. Everything influenced value. The buyers knew exactly what they wanted. Some carefully examined hands, looking for signs of hard physical labor. Others asked interpreters about occupations. Blacksmith, farmer, carpenter, stonemason, scribe, teacher, doctor. Every answer affected negotiations. Ancient writers tell us that professional slave dealers often cleaned and dressed captives before offering them for sale. Hair might be trimmed, skin washed, simple clothing provided. The goal was obvious. Presentation increased value. Just as merchants polished bronze statues before displaying them, or cleaned dust from expensive pottery, they attempted to make human beings appear more desirable. It was a deeply unsettling practice, one that revealed how completely commercial thinking had replaced compassion. Signs sometimes hung around a person's neck. These described useful information for buyers. Age, place of origin, skills, health, whether the seller guaranteed the information. Roman law required certain defects or medical conditions to be disclosed, not because lawmakers wished to protect enslaved people, but because they wished to protect buyers from financial fraud. Commerce demanded honesty between merchants, even while treating human lives as merchandise. The contradiction feels impossible today. Yet within Roman law, it appeared perfectly logical. Nearby, business continued as though nothing unusual were happening. A baker sold warm loaves to passing customers. A jeweler displayed delicate gold rings inside a shaded stall. A sailor laughed loudly after hearing a joke from an old friend. Life flowed onward. Ordinary routines surrounded extraordinary suffering. History often reminds us that human beings possess an astonishing ability to accept almost anything as normal. If enough time passes, the island itself reflected tremendous wealth. Elegant homes overlooked the harbor. Their courtyards contained colorful mosaics depicting dolphins, sea creatures, and scenes from Greek mythology. Fresh water flowed through carefully engineered fountains. Imported marble decorated public buildings. Statues honored wealthy benefactors who had donated money to improve the city. Visitors frequently admired Delos' prosperity. They praised its architecture, its temples, its bustling markets, its international atmosphere. Few paused to ask where much of that wealth truly originated. Trade generated enormous profits, but slavery multiplied those profits even further. Every successful military campaign across the Mediterranean supplied fresh captives. Every pirate raid increased available labor. Every conquered kingdom strengthened the commercial system centered on places like Delos. From the perspective of Roman investors, the arrangement seemed remarkably efficient. From the perspective of those standing behind the market fences, it was something entirely different. Among the waiting captives stood an elderly man whose hands revealed decades of careful craftsmanship. His fingers were rough, but not from farming. They carried the small scars of someone accustomed to carving wood with precision. Perhaps he had built fishing boats, perhaps furniture, perhaps temple doors. No surviving record tells us his name. History rarely preserved the identities of ordinary enslaved people. Instead, we know them only through scattered documents, legal records, and the observations of ancient writers. Their individual stories quietly disappeared. Yet together, they formed the foundation upon which much of the Roman economy was built. And as the marketplace grew louder with each passing hour, another ordinary business day had only just begun. As the morning continued, the marketplace settled into a steady rhythm. It was not loud in the way a modern city is loud. There were no engines, no horns, no machines. Instead, the sounds arrived gently, one after another. Leather sandals scraped across smooth stone. Wooden wagon wheels rolled slowly over uneven streets. Merchants greeted familiar customers. Seagulls cried overhead as they circled the harbor. Somewhere in the distance, a blacksmith's hammer struck hot iron with slow, measured blows. The island seemed alive, not hurried, simply busy. Visitors arriving from overseas often described Delos as one of the most fascinating places in the Mediterranean. It was a meeting point for cultures. A traveler could hear half a dozen languages before walking the length of a single street. Greek remained the most common language. Latin was heard more frequently as Roman influence expanded. Egyptian merchants negotiated with Phoenician sailors. Jewish traders discussed prices with merchants from Asia Minor. Every conversation reminded visitors that this tiny island connected much of the ancient world. Goods traveled incredible distances. Silk from the distant east, ivory from Africa, glass from Syria, papyrus from Egypt, fine pottery from Greece, wine from Italy. olive oil from Hispania. Everything eventually found its way through ports like Delos. The Mediterranean was sometimes called the heart of the ancient world. If that was true, then Delos was one of its busiest chambers. Ships arrived almost every day during the sailing season. Captains carefully watched the weather. Winter storms made travel dangerous. Ancient ships depended almost entirely upon favorable winds. Few captains willingly crossed rough seas during the colder months. As a result, commerce followed the seasons. Spring brought activity. Summer brought prosperity. Autumn hurried everyone to finish their business before storms returned. Winter slowed nearly everything. Even slavery followed this rhythm. More ships meant more captives. More captives meant larger markets. Larger markets attracted more buyers. The entire system fed itself. Nearby, one young merchant stood beneath a canvas awning, carefully studying a wax tablet. He was not especially wealthy. At least not yet. His clothing was clean but simple. His beard neatly trimmed. His sandals showed signs of frequent travel. He represented a growing class of Roman businessmen who viewed commerce as the fastest path toward fortune. Unlike senators, merchants built influence through trade rather than politics. Every successful voyage expanded their reputation. Every profitable investment opened new opportunities. Many dreamed of becoming wealthy enough to purchase grand villas overlooking the Bay of Naples. Some achieved that dream. Many did not. Trade remained risky. Ships disappeared during storms. Pirates attacked merchant vessels. Cargo spoiled. Markets changed. Prices fluctuated. Fortunes appeared almost as quickly as they vanished. Yet despite these dangers, investors continued arriving. The rewards were simply too great. The young merchant glanced toward the slave market. He did not see individuals. He saw numbers, potential workers, future profits, possible investments. It was a way of thinking encouraged throughout much of Roman society. Many respectable citizens never questioned it. To them, slavery seemed as natural as farming or fishing. Children grew up surrounded by enslaved servants. Public buildings were cleaned by enslaved workers. Fields were harvested by enslaved laborers. Even government officials relied upon enslaved assistants. The institution became so deeply woven into daily life that many Romans rarely imagined an alternative. History reminds us that people often accept the systems into which they are born. Practices that appear shocking centuries later once seemed completely ordinary. That does not make them right, but it helps explain how such systems endured for generations. Far beyond the marketplace, fishermen returned to the harbor with their morning catch. Fresh tuna, sea bream, mackerel, octopus. The fish market quickly filled with customers hopping to purchase the freshest meals before the afternoon heat arrived. Nearby, women selected vegetables from wooden baskets. Children laughed while chasing one another between market stalls. An elderly storyteller entertained listeners beneath the shade of an olive tree. Life continued. Normal life. That contrast is one of the most remarkable aspects of history. Moments of profound suffering often existed only a few streets away from moments of ordinary happiness. One family celebrated a wedding. Another mourned a funeral. One merchant signed a profitable agreement. Another declared bankruptcy. One child was born. Another person lost everything. Human history has always contained countless stories unfolding at exactly the same moment. Delos was no different. As the sun climbed higher, shadows grew shorter. The marble buildings reflected bright white light across the streets. Workers paused occasionally to drink water from clay cups. Donkeys rested beneath shaded walls. Even the busiest merchants slowed their pace for a few minutes. Heat changes the rhythm of every Mediterranean afternoon. The island understood this long before modern air conditioning. Architecture helped. Many homes surrounded cool interior courtyards. Thick stone walls trapped the night's lower temperatures. Narrow streets created welcome pockets of shade. Simple engineering made daily life more comfortable. The ancient world possessed remarkable practical knowledge. Not every invention required advanced technology. Sometimes thoughtful design accomplished enough. In one quiet courtyard overlooking the harbor, an elderly Greek philosopher sat reading a scroll. His students gathered nearby. They discussed ethics, justice, virtue, the nature of happiness. It seems almost impossible. While one group debated the meaning of justice, only a short walk away, human beings were being bought and sold. History rarely fits neatly into simple stories. Civilizations capable of extraordinary beauty often carried extraordinary cruelty at the same time. The same society that produced breathtaking sculpture, magnificent architecture, sophisticated philosophy, and lasting literature also accepted slavery as an ordinary part of life. That uncomfortable truth reminds us that progress is rarely complete. Every generation leaves behind achievements. Every generation leaves behind failures. The people of Delos did not believe they were living through history. To them, it was simply another warm morning on a prosperous island, surrounded by a brilliant blue sea. And as another merchant ship slowly appeared on the distant horizon, the harbor prepared to welcome yet another cargo whose arrival would shape countless lives before the day was over. Far beyond the harbor, the sea shimmered beneath the late morning sun. From a distance, another merchant vessel appeared no larger than a seabird resting on the horizon. Its square sail caught the gentle breeze, carrying it steadily toward Delos. To experienced harbor workers, the ship revealed its story long before it reached the docks. Its shape suggested that it had traveled a considerable distance. The weathered hull carried the marks of many voyages. Salt had bleached sections of its ropes almost white. Several sailors moved carefully across the deck, adjusting lines with practiced confidence. Nothing about the ship seemed unusual. Hundreds like it visited Delos every year. Yet every arrival brought new stories. Stories of distant kingdoms, of dangerous storms, of successful trade, and sometimes of lives that had changed forever. Ancient Mediterranean travel required patience. Ships rarely sailed in straight lines across open water. Captains preferred to remain within sight of land whenever possible. Coastlines offered shelter during sudden storms. Fresh water could be collected at friendly ports. Damaged ships could be repaired before continuing their journeys. Navigation depended upon experience far more than instruments. During clear nights, sailors studied the stars. By day, they watched the position of the sun. They recognized familiar mountains rising above distant shores. Every experienced captain carried an invisible map inside his memory. The sea rewarded knowledge. It punished mistakes. As the vessel approached the harbor, workers along the docks prepared thick ropes. The ship slowed gradually. Oars entered the water to guide it between rows of anchored vessels. Commands echoed calmly across the deck. There was no panic, no shouting born of fear, only the confident voices of men who had repeated the same routine hundreds of times. With a soft wooden thud, the hull touched the dock. Ropes were thrown, not secured. The voyage was over. Almost immediately, officials stepped aboard. Rome valued records. Cargo had to be documented. Taxes calculated. Ownership confirmed. Merchants disliked uncertainty. Paperwork, or rather, wax tablets and written scrolls, was just as important as the cargo itself. Nearby, scribes patiently copied information onto fresh tablets. They worked with remarkable concentration. A single mistake could create costly disagreements later. Accuracy meant profit. Accuracy also meant trust. Business depended upon both. While officials completed their work, the harbor continued its endless movement. Fresh water was carried aboard outgoing ships. Barrels of olive oil rolled down wooden ramps. Bundles of wool disappeared into crowded warehouses. Everything flowed with quiet purpose. Nothing remained still for long. Delos never truly slept during the trading season. Even after sunset, lanterns often glowed along the waterfront as sailors prepared for the following day's departure. The island existed because of movement. Ships arrived. Ships departed. Merchants came. Merchants left. Goods changed hands. Coins exchanged owners. Only the stone temples overlooking the harbor seemed permanent. Everything else belonged to constant motion. Among the newest arrivals stood a young boy, perhaps no older than 12. His clothing was worn from weeks at sea. His eyes moved carefully across the unfamiliar island. Every building seemed strange. Every face belonged to a stranger. No surviving document records his name. History is often silent about children like him. We know they existed. Ancient writers occasionally mentioned them. Legal records confirmed their sale. Yet their own voices have almost entirely disappeared. That silence speaks powerfully across the centuries. Countless ordinary lives vanished from history simply because no one thought to preserve their stories. Today, archaeologists attempt to recover those forgotten lives through fragments. A broken pottery bowl. A discarded coin. A worn sandal. A damaged inscription. Even the smallest discovery helps rebuild a world that disappeared long ago. Delos itself remained hidden beneath layers of earth for many centuries after its decline. Gradually, buildings collapsed. Roofs disappeared. Columns fell. Wind carried dust through abandoned streets. Plants grew where merchants once negotiated fortunes. For generations, silence replaced commerce. Only much later did archaeologists begin carefully uncovering the island once again. Their work transformed our understanding of ancient Mediterranean trade. Today, visitors walking through Delos can still see stone streets that echoed beneath Roman footsteps more than 2,000 years ago. They can explore elegant houses decorated with colorful mosaics. They can stand inside marketplaces, walk among temple ruins, look across the same blue sea that ancient sailors once crossed. The island has become quiet again. Seagulls now outnumber merchants. Wildflowers grow where warehouses once stood. The busiest slave market in the Mediterranean has become one of history's most peaceful archaeological sites. Time possesses an extraordinary ability to transform places. Cities rise. Cities fall. Empires expand. Empires disappear. Yet landscapes often remain surprisingly familiar. The same sunlight still warms the stones. The same winds sweep across the hills. The same waves reach the shoreline. Nature remembers differently than people do. As noon approached, church bells did not ring. Of course, Christianity had not yet spread across the Roman world. Instead, the sounds drifting across Delos came from temple courtyards, busy workshops, and crowded marketplaces. Priests burned fragrant incense before ancient gods. Craftsmen carved marble with careful precision. Merchants counted silver coins. Life continued exactly as it had the day before, and almost certainly as it would continue tomorrow. For most residents, remarkable historical events were invisible. History rarely announces itself while it is happening. Only centuries later do we recognize certain places as important. Only later do we understand that ordinary mornings sometimes shape extraordinary futures. Delos was one of those places. A small island, a sacred sanctuary, a commercial crossroads, and for a remarkable period in history, one of the busiest centers of human trade the ancient world had ever known. The afternoon sun climbed higher. The harbor shimmered beneath brilliant light. Another sail appeared on the horizon. Another journey was ending. Another story was about to begin. And the island, as always, quietly prepared to receive it. End of this section of Part 1. The story continues seamlessly in the next section. The afternoon settled gently over Delos. The bright sunlight softened the colors of the sea until the water looked almost like polished glass. A warm breeze drifted through the harbor, carrying with it the familiar scents of salt, olive oil, fresh bread, and weathered timber. For sailors who had spent weeks at sea, the smell of land brought a quiet sense of relief. Many voyages across the Mediterranean were unpredictable. A journey that should have taken 6 days could suddenly stretch into 2 weeks if the wind refused to cooperate. Unlike modern ships, ancient merchant vessels depended almost entirely upon nature. The sea decided the schedule. Captains merely adapted. Some sailors spent their long days repairing torn sails. Others inspected ropes that had slowly weakened beneath constant exposure to seawater. Every knot mattered. Every wooden plank mattered. A single unnoticed crack could become disastrous during a storm. The Romans admired discipline. A well-maintained ship represented careful planning. A neglected one represented unnecessary risk. As merchants completed their business along the docks, small groups of travelers wandered through the streets. Some had arrived only to purchase supplies before continuing toward Athens. Others hoped to visit the island's famous temples. Even though Delos had become a commercial powerhouse, it never completely lost its sacred identity. Pilgrims still traveled here to honor Apollo. They climbed the stone paths leading toward the sanctuary, carrying offerings of flowers, oil, wine, or finely crafted statues. The temples stood peacefully above the busy harbor, almost untouched by the noise below. It created a remarkable contrast. Below, merchants discussed prices. Above, priests offered prayers. Below, fortunes changed hands. Above, worshippers searched for peace. Ancient life often placed the practical and the spiritual side by side. Neither seemed unusual to the people who lived there. In one shaded courtyard, a wealthy merchant relaxed beside a fountain while his servants prepared the afternoon meal. The courtyard was beautifully designed. White marble columns surrounded a small garden filled with herbs and flowering plants. A pair of doves rested near the edge of the fountain, occasionally dipping their beaks into the cool water. The merchant had traveled across the Mediterranean for nearly 20 years. He knew every major port: Alexandria, Rhodes, Corinth, Carthage, Puteoli, Ostia. Each city possessed its own character. Each had its own opportunities. But Delos remained his favorite. Business moved quickly here. Buyers arrived with money ready to spend. Sellers rarely waited long. Time truly became wealth. He remembered visiting the island as a young apprentice. Back then, he had carried account books instead of owning them. He had watched experienced traders negotiate deals that seemed impossibly large. Thousands of silver coins exchanged hands in a single afternoon. Entire shiploads of cargo sold before sunset. Those early years had taught him an important lesson. Knowledge traveled farther than ships. A merchant who understood changing markets could become richer than one who simply owned larger vessels. Information itself became valuable. News of poor harvests in Egypt could increase grain prices across the Mediterranean. Rumors of piracy might delay shipping routes. Political instability in distant kingdoms often created entirely new business opportunities. Successful traders listened carefully. Every conversation mattered. Back at the harbor, another cargo was being unloaded. Not precious spices, not marble, not bronze. Simple wooden barrels filled with salted fish. Salt preserved food remarkably well in the ancient world. Without refrigeration, preservation meant survival. Fish caught during one season could feed families months later. Merchants understood this. Large shipments of preserved food remained among the most dependable forms of trade. Nearby, potters carefully stacked hundreds of clay amphorae inside a warehouse. These tall storage jars appeared everywhere throughout the Roman world. Wine, olive oil, honey, grain, fish sauce. Nearly everything traveled inside amphorae. Today, archaeologists often discover broken pieces buried beneath ancient cities. Even shattered fragments reveal surprising information. The shape of an amphora can identify where it was made. Small markings reveal the workshop. Sometimes the name of the merchant survives. History occasionally hides inside the smallest objects. The same cannot always be said for people. Countless ordinary men, women, and children disappeared without leaving behind a single written word. No letters, no diaries, no family records, only silence. That silence challenges modern historians. How do you understand lives that were never recorded? The answer comes slowly, patiently, by combining archaeology with ancient writings, by studying houses, roads, markets, coins, tools. Every discovery adds another small piece to an enormous puzzle. The Delos we know today is the result of generations of careful excavation. Stone by stone, room by room, street by street, scholars have slowly reconstructed one of antiquity's most fascinating trading centers. Walking through its ruins today requires imagination. The buildings no longer have wooden roofs. Painted walls have faded. Doors disappeared centuries ago. Yet the streets remain. You can still follow the same path once used by merchants carrying ledgers beneath their arms. You can still stand where sailors unloaded cargo from distant lands. You can still look toward the harbor and imagine hundreds of sails covering the horizon. It is surprisingly quiet now. Only the wind moves freely through the empty ruins. Perhaps that silence is fitting. Places once filled with endless noise eventually become peaceful again. The marketplace that echoed with thousands of voices has long since surrendered to birdsong and the gentle whisper of sea breezes. As afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, long shadows stretched across the marble streets. The intense heat began to fade. Shopkeepers prepared for the final customers of the day. Some counted their earnings. Others carefully covered expensive goods with cloth before closing their stalls. The harbor remained busy. A few ships prepared to depart with the evening tide. Others would remain anchored until morning. Far across the water, the sun slowly began its descent. Its golden light, reflected across the calm Mediterranean like a pathway, stretching toward the western horizon. Few sights impressed ancient travelers more than a Mediterranean sunset. After long weeks surrounded by open water, many sailors simply sat quietly on the docks, watching the changing colors without speaking. Some moments require no conversation, only quiet appreciation. And as the island settled into the peaceful rhythm of evening, Delos prepared for another day that would begin exactly as this one had, with the first light of dawn, the arrival of new ships, and the endless flow of history across its remarkable shores. Part 2. Night arrived quietly over Delos. The brilliant blue of the Mediterranean slowly faded into deep shades of purple and silver. One by one, small oil lamps began to glow inside homes overlooking the harbor. Their warm light flickered gently through open windows, dancing across white stone walls that had absorbed the day's heat. The marketplace, so full of movement only hours before, became surprisingly peaceful. Wooden stalls stood empty. Canvas awnings fluttered softly in the evening breeze. The voices of merchants had disappeared, replaced by the distant sound of waves touching the harbor wall. For many visitors, this was the most beautiful time of day. The heat had faded. The sea had grown calm once again. Above the island, hundreds of stars slowly emerged across the clear Mediterranean sky. Without electric lights, the ancient night felt astonishingly bright. The Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other like a pale river flowing through the heavens. Roman sailors knew these stars well. For generations, they had trusted them more than any map. Long before compasses became common, experienced captains memorized the night sky. The constellation we now call Ursa Major helped them find direction. The North Star remained a quiet guide during clear nights. Although it was not positioned exactly where it is today because of Earth's slow axial movement, it still served as an important point of reference for navigation. The sea rewarded those who understood the sky. On the western side of the harbor, several merchant ships remained anchored for the night. Their sails had been folded neatly. Lanterns hung from the masts, their reflections shimmering gently on the dark water. From a distance, they looked almost like floating stars. The sailors were finally able to rest. Life aboard an ancient merchant ship was rarely comfortable. Most crew members slept on simple blankets spread across the wooden deck. Space was limited. Privacy was almost non-existent. Fresh water had to be rationed carefully. Food was simple: hard bread, dried fish, olives, cheese, and occasionally fruit when it was available. Even so, many sailors preferred life at sea to working in dangerous mines or exhausting agricultural estates. The sea was unpredictable, but it also offered freedom. Every voyage carried the promise of seeing another coastline, another city, another culture, another sunrise. Near the center of Delos, a public fountain continued flowing long after sunset. Travelers filled clay jars before returning to nearby inns. Water was precious on the island. Delos had very few natural springs, so the people relied heavily on carefully engineered cisterns that collected rainwater during the wetter months. The Greeks had become remarkably skilled at managing limited water supplies. Every drop mattered. Roman engineers admired these systems and often expanded upon them wherever they built new settlements. Many ancient civilizations survived not because they possessed abundant resources, but because they learned to use limited resources wisely. Inside one modest inn near the harbor, merchants gathered around a wooden table. A simple meal rested before them. Fresh bread, olives, goat cheese, lentil stew, a small jug of local wine. Their conversation moved easily from one subject to another. Shipping routes, weather, politics in Rome, harvests in Egypt, rumors from distant provinces. Business rarely stopped completely. Even during dinner, opportunities were discussed. A profitable conversation over bread could become tomorrow's successful investment. One elderly merchant spoke quietly about how much Delos had changed during his lifetime. "When I first came here," he said, "the temples drew more visitors than the warehouses." The others smiled. They understood exactly what he meant. Years earlier, pilgrims had filled many of the streets. Now merchants outnumbered them. Trade had gradually become the island's heartbeat. Not overnight, not through a single dramatic event, but slowly, year after year, ship after ship, market after market. History often changes places so gradually that few people notice while it is happening. Only later does the transformation become obvious. Outside, the breeze carried the scent of the sea through the quiet streets. Most workshops had already closed. Blacksmiths allowed their furnaces to cool. Potters carefully covered unfinished pieces. Carpenters stored their tool before locking heavy wooden doors. The island rested. Yet not everyone slept peacefully. Some remained awake beneath careful guard. For those who had arrived on the day's slave ships, uncertainty lingered long after darkness had fallen. Many wondered where tomorrow would take them. Would they remain on Delos? Would they sail for Italy? For Greece? For Egypt? No one told them. Tomorrow's sunrise would reveal the answer. And so beneath the same sky, two very different nights unfolded. One merchant dreamed of expanding his business. Another traveler dreamed of returning home. A sailor dreamed of favorable winds. A child dreamed of seeing family again. The stars shone equally upon all of them. Silent, unchanging, indifferent to the hopes and fears of those below. As midnight approached, Delos became almost completely still. Only the gentle rhythm of waves against the harbor could be heard. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another fleet of ships, another busy marketplace, another ordinary day in one of the busiest trading centers of the ancient Mediterranean. But for now, the island slept beneath a sky filled with stars, waiting quietly for history to begin again with the first light of dawn. Long before the first hint of daylight appeared, Delos was already beginning to wake. The stars still filled the sky, but a faint silver line rested low on the eastern horizon. The air felt noticeably cooler than it had only a few hours earlier. A gentle breeze drifted inland from the sea, carrying the clean scent of salt water through the quiet streets. For a brief moment, the island belonged almost entirely to nature. The cries of gulls echoed across the harbor. Small waves lapped softly against the stone quay. Somewhere among the rocky hills, a rooster announced the coming morning. The city had not yet found its voice. In one corner of the harbor, an elderly fisherman quietly untied the ropes securing his small wooden boat. Unlike the great merchant vessels that crossed the Mediterranean, his craft was simple. It had been built for short journeys close to shore. Its wood had darkened after years beneath the sun and sea spray. The old fisherman had performed this same routine for decades. He checked his fishing nets with practiced hands. He examined the knots. He made sure the oars rested securely inside the boat. Nothing was rushed. There was comfort in repetition. There was peace in familiar work. For men like him, the sea was not simply a place of business. It was part of everyday life. He knew where fish gathered during different seasons. He understood how changing winds affected the currents. He could often predict the weather simply by watching the clouds before sunrise. Knowledge like this rarely appeared in books. It passed quietly from one generation to the next. Father to son, Master to apprentice, neighbor to neighbor. Much of the ancient world survived because people remembered. As the first golden rays of sunlight touched the highest hill on Delos, the island slowly emerged from darkness. Marble temples caught the light first. Their pale stone glowed warmly against the deep blue sky. Then came the rooftops, the narrow streets, the crowded warehouses lining the harbor. Finally, sunlight reached the docks themselves, where sailors had already begun another busy morning. Several merchant ships had departed before dawn, hopping to take advantage of favorable winds. Others were only now preparing to unload their cargo. Every sunrise brought new possibilities. Some ships carried grain from Egypt. Others transported wine from Italy. A few arrived with valuable marble from nearby islands. No captain could predict exactly what business awaited him until he entered the harbor. Trade depended upon timing as much as skill. Nearby, dockworkers stretched tired muscles before beginning another long day. Their work demanded strength rather than wealth. Heavy amphorae filled with olive oil could weigh well over 100 pounds. Large blocks of marble required teams of workers using wooden rollers, thick ropes, and remarkable coordination. There were no cranes powered by electricity, no forklifts, no engines. Everything depended upon human effort. Careful planning often mattered more than raw strength. Ancient engineers understood leverage remarkably well. Simple wooden beams could move astonishingly heavy loads when used correctly. Knowledge multiplied strength. As the harbor became busier, another familiar sound spread through the streets. The smell of freshly baked bread. Small neighborhood ovens had already been burning for hours. Bakers mixed flour, water, salt, and sourdough starter before sunrise. By early morning, warm loaves filled woven baskets awaiting customers. Bread formed the foundation of most meals throughout the Roman world. Rich or poor, almost everyone ate it. The quality differed. Wealthy families enjoyed fine white flour. Ordinary workers often relied upon darker, coarser bread made from barley or mixed grains. Even so, fresh bread remained one of life's simple pleasures. Travelers passing through Delos frequently praised its busy markets. Almost anything could be purchased here. Fresh fruit, imported spices, fine textiles, bronze tools, glassware, jewelry, perfumes, medicinal herbs. Exotic animals occasionally appeared as well, astonishing curious visitors who had never seen such creatures before. The marketplace reflected the enormous reach of Mediterranean commerce. Every object carried a story. A small ivory carving might have begun its journey deep within Africa. A silk cloth may have traveled thousands of miles through countless hands before finally reaching Delos. Trade connected civilizations that never met directly. Few people understood the complete journey of the goods they purchased. Yet every purchase formed one tiny link in a much larger network stretching across continents. As the streets filled with activity, the slave market also prepared to open once again. The wooden platforms remained exactly where they had stood yesterday. The clerks returned to their tables. The guards resumed their positions. Nothing appeared unusual. Business simply continued. That ordinary appearance is perhaps the most unsettling part of the story. There were no grand ceremonies, no dramatic announcements, only routine. Routine repeated day after day, year after year, generation after generation. History often teaches us that enormous systems survive not because of constant excitement, but because they become ordinary. People stop questioning what they see every day. They simply accept it. On Delos, Thousands of people walked past the slave market during their daily errands. Many hardly glanced toward it. They had become accustomed to its presence. For them, it belonged to the landscape just as naturally as the harbor, the temples, or the warehouses. Yet for every person standing inside the market, nothing about the day felt ordinary. For them, everything had changed. And as the morning sun climbed steadily higher above the sparkling Mediterranean, another chapter in the long history of Delos quietly unfolded, one calm sunrise at a time. By the second hour after sunrise, Delos had become a city in constant motion. From the highest temple overlooking the harbor, the island resembled a carefully organized machine. Ships arrived. Cargo disappeared into warehouses. Donkeys carried heavy loads through narrow streets. Merchants hurried between counting houses. Messengers crossed busy squares carrying wax tablets tucked beneath their arms. Every person seemed to know exactly where they were going. The island was small, yet its influence stretched across the Mediterranean. Historians estimate that, during its busiest years in the 2nd century BC, Delos became one of the most active free ports in the ancient world. Its location made it almost impossible to avoid. A captain sailing from Egypt toward Greece often found Delos to be the perfect stopping point. The same was true for traders traveling west toward Italy or east toward Asia Minor. Commerce naturally gathered where sea routes met. And wherever commerce flourished, people followed. Walking through the streets of Delos could feel like walking through several different countries at once. A merchant from Alexandria bargained in Greek. Nearby, a Roman trader answered in Latin. A sailor from Phoenicia laughed with an old friend in another language entirely. Children born on the island often grew up hearing several languages every day. For them, diversity was ordinary. The ancient Mediterranean was far more connected than many people imagine. Ideas traveled with merchants. Religion spread with sailors. Recipes crossed oceans inside the memories of cooks. Fashion changed as travelers introduced new styles from distant ports. Even words moved from one language into another. Trade carried more than cargo. It carried culture. Near the center of the marketplace stood a public notice board carved from smooth stone. Official announcements were displayed there for everyone to read. New taxes, religious festivals, commercial regulations, legal decisions. Literacy was valuable. Not everyone could read, but those who could often read aloud for neighbors and friends. Information spread quickly. A successful merchant depended upon knowing what others did not. News could be worth more than silver. In one shaded arcade, money changers sat behind sturdy wooden tables. Coins from dozens of kingdoms passed through their hands every day. Roman denarii, Greek drachmas, Egyptian tetradrachms. Each had its own value. Each required careful examination. Counterfeit coins existed even in the ancient world. Experienced bankers weighed suspicious pieces before accepting them. Trust formed the foundation of every successful marketplace. Without confidence in money, commerce slowed. Without commerce, Delos would lose its importance. Nearby, scribes remained busy copying contracts onto fresh sheets of papyrus. Their handwriting was remarkably neat. Every letter carefully formed. A mistake inside a commercial agreement could become expensive. Patience mattered. Accuracy mattered. Business depended upon written records almost as much as spoken promises. Many wealthy merchants kept entire collections of contracts locked inside wooden chests. Those documents represented years of investments, years of risk, years of opportunity. Across the street, the aroma of fresh herbs drifted from a physician's small shop. Unlike modern medicine, ancient healing combined careful observation with tradition, experience, and philosophy. Shelves held jars filled with dried plants collected from across the Mediterranean. Mint, sage, thyme, fennel, chamomile. Some remedies worked surprisingly well. Others had little effect. Even so, physicians occupied respected positions within society. A skilled doctor could become extremely valuable. Sometimes, educated physicians who had themselves been enslaved eventually earned enough trust to receive their freedom. Such stories were uncommon, but they remind us that life inside the Roman world was often more complicated than simple categories suggest. Not every enslaved person lived the same life. Some worked under brutal conditions in mines. Others became accountants, teachers, architects, musicians, or doctors inside wealthy households. Their circumstances differed enormously. Yet they all shared one reality. Their lives belonged to someone else. As the morning advanced, sunlight poured into the harbor. The sea sparkled so brightly that sailors occasionally shaded their eyes with their hands. Far beyond the docks, dolphins briefly surfaced before disappearing beneath the calm blue water. Ancient sailors considered dolphins a welcome sight. Many believed they brought good fortune. Stories about dolphins rescuing drowning sailors had circulated throughout the Mediterranean for centuries. Whether true or not, such tales reflected the deep relationship between people and the sea. For those who depended upon ships, every voyage involved uncertainty. A favorable wind could create wealth. A violent storm could erase it overnight. That uncertainty shaped the character of Mediterranean merchants. They learned to prepare carefully, to adapt quickly, to remain patient. Nature could not be negotiated with. As another bell sounded softly from a nearby sanctuary, priests began preparing for the day's religious offerings. Small clouds of fragrant incense drifted upward into the warm morning air. Visitors quietly climbed the temple steps carrying baskets of fruit, flowers, olive oil, and wine. For a few peaceful moments, the sounds of prayer blended gently with the distant rhythm of waves against the harbor. Delos remained at its heart a sacred island. Commerce had transformed its economy, but faith still shaped much of daily life. It was entirely possible for a merchant to negotiate a profitable business agreement in the morning, offer thanks to Apollo before noon, and sail for another country before sunset. The ancient world rarely separated religion from everyday life. Everything belonged together. Trade, travel, family, work, faith. As the shadows slowly shortened beneath the growing sun, another ordinary day unfolded on Delos. To the people living there, it seemed like countless days before it. But to us, looking back across more than 2,000 years, each quiet moment offers another window into a remarkable world that once stood at the center of the Mediterranean and quietly changed the course of history. As the morning slowly drifted toward noon, the harbor reached its busiest moment of the day. The gentle calm of sunrise had given way to a carefully organized rhythm that repeated itself almost every day during the sailing season. From above, the docks looked like the gears of an enormous clock. Nothing appeared rushed, yet nothing stood still. A team of dockworkers rolled heavy amphorae toward a warehouse built from thick blocks of local stone. Each jar stood nearly as tall as a child. Most carried olive oil from southern Greece. Others contained wine from Italy or salted fish from the Black Sea. The pointed bottoms of the amphorae allowed them to be stacked securely inside the holds of ships. Modern cargo containers did not exist, but the Romans had developed their own remarkably efficient system. Everything had its place. Everything followed a routine. Ancient commerce depended upon order. One careless mistake could ruin an entire shipment. Nearby, a shipwright carefully examined the hull of a merchant vessel that had arrived only the previous evening. He ran his hand slowly across the wooden planks, searching for damage caused by hidden rocks or months at sea. The smell of pine resin filled the air. Workers heated thick black pitch over a small fire before brushing it into narrow gaps between the boards. This simple process helped keep seawater from leaking inside the ship. Without constant maintenance, few wooden vessels survived many years. The Mediterranean could appear peaceful, but experienced sailors respected it deeply. Storms could develop with little warning. Powerful winds sometimes pushed ships toward dangerous coastlines. Even skilled captains occasionally disappeared without a trace. For that reason, every successful arrival in Delos represented far more than a business opportunity. It represented survival. Across the marketplace, an elderly woman arranged woven baskets filled with figs, almonds, walnuts, and fresh dates. She had sold food in the same corner of the market for nearly 30 years. Regular customers greeted her by name. She knew which sailors preferred dried fruit before long voyages. She knew which children always asked for the sweetest figs. She even knew which merchants liked to bargain, even when the price was already fair. Small businesses relied upon relationships. Trust took years to build. One satisfied customer often returned again and again. As she arranged her baskets, she watched another group of travelers arrive from the harbor. Some looked exhausted after days at sea. Others appeared excited to explore the famous island. Many carried small leather pouches containing coins from distant cities. Travelers rarely visited Delos empty-handed. Commerce attracted people from every corner of the Mediterranean. Not all came to trade. Some simply came to see. The island's temples were admired throughout the Greek world. Its marble terraces overlooked sparkling blue water. Its sacred lake, though now dry in modern times, had once reflected the surrounding columns like a mirror. Pilgrims believed they were walking upon holy ground. Centuries before Delos became famous as a commercial center, it had already earned a place in mythology. According to ancient Greek tradition, this was the birthplace of Apollo, the god of light, music, healing, and prophecy, and his twin sister Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon. Whether visitors believed every story or not, the island inspired respect. Religion and commerce existed side by side. It was not unusual to see a wealthy merchant pause before entering the marketplace to leave a small offering at a nearby temple. Good fortune at sea was never taken for granted. Many sailors believed the gods deserved thanks after every safe voyage. Some even painted protective symbols onto the bows of their ships. Faith offered comfort in a world filled with uncertainty. Farther inland, beyond the busiest streets, quieter neighborhoods spread across gentle hillsides. Here, elegant homes surrounded peaceful courtyards filled with flowering plants. Small fountains cooled the air. Colorful mosaics decorated stone floors with images of dolphins, sea horses, vines, and mythical creatures. Although time has faded many of these artworks, archaeologists continue to uncover astonishing examples of Roman and Greek craftsmanship on Delos. Some mosaics are so detailed that individual feathers, fish scales, and flower petals remain visible after more than 2,000 years. Walking through these ancient houses today offers a rare glimpse into everyday life. Not the lives of emperors, not famous generals, but ordinary wealthy families who once looked out over the same blue sea. As the sun climbed higher, many people sought the shade of covered walkways. Mediterranean summers could become intensely hot by early afternoon. Business slowed slightly. Even the busiest merchants understood that working beneath the strongest sunlight exhausted both people and animals. Donkeys rested beside stone walls. Dogs slept beneath wagons. Shopkeepers poured cool water into clay cups. Conversation became quieter. The island seemed to pause for a brief moment. Only the harbor continued moving without interruption. Ships followed tides rather than comfort. Captains took advantage of favorable winds whenever they appeared. Nature always set the schedule. One experienced sailor often told younger crew members a simple lesson. "You can argue with another man," he would say, "but never argue with the sea." It was advice earned through decades of experience. The Mediterranean rewarded patience. It punished pride. Perhaps that is one reason ancient sailors developed such deep respect for the natural world. The wind, the stars, the currents, the weather, all demanded careful attention. Ignoring them could cost lives. As another quiet afternoon settled over Delos, life continued much as it had the day before. Merchants traded. Pilgrims prayed. Fishermen cast their nets. Children laughed in shaded courtyards. And beyond the harbor, new sails slowly appeared on the distant horizon, reminding everyone that tomorrow would bring fresh travelers, fresh stories, and another peaceful sunrise over one of the most extraordinary islands of the ancient world. The afternoon sun drifted slowly across the sky, and the shadows of the marble columns stretched a little farther over the stone streets. This was the quietest part of the day. Many merchants paused their work. Some sat beneath linen awnings, enjoying cups of watered wine. Others rested on wooden benches while discussing tomorrow's prices or the latest news arriving from distant ports. In the ancient Mediterranean, news traveled no faster than the fastest ship. A letter written in Alexandria might take weeks to reach Delos. A message from Rome depended entirely on favorable winds. Storms, pirates, or damaged ships could delay important information for months. Because of this, every arriving vessel carried more than cargo. It carried stories, rumors, political news, business opportunities. Sometimes, a captain stepping onto the dock became the most important source of information on the entire island. Crowds gathered around experienced sailors, eager to hear what they had seen. How was the weather near Crete? Has the grain harvest in Egypt been good this year? Are the ports in Asia Minor still busy? Questions filled the air. Answers quickly spread through the marketplace. Long before newspapers or radios, conversations connected the ancient world. Knowledge moved from mouth to mouth. Memory served as history's first library. Among those listening carefully was a young apprentice merchant named Marcus. He had arrived on Delos only 2 years earlier. His father owned a small olive grove in southern Italy, but Marcus dreamed of something much larger. He wanted to become one of the great traders whose ships crossed the entire Mediterranean. Every afternoon, after completing his duties, he stood near the harbor listening to older merchants. He rarely interrupted. Instead, he observed. He watched how experienced traders greeted one another. He noticed which captains inspired confidence. He learned that successful business depended not only on money, but also on reputation. A merchant known for honesty often received better opportunities than one known for greed. Trust could not be purchased. It had to be earned. Slowly, patiently, one fair deal at a time. Nearby, a gray-haired scribe continued copying contracts despite the afternoon heat. His handwriting remained beautifully consistent. Every letter appeared carefully balanced. Every line perfectly straight. He understood something important. Long after spoken words disappeared into the air, written agreements remained. They protected buyers. They protected sellers. Most importantly, they preserved memory. Today, much of what historians know about Roman commerce comes from records written by people like him. Tiny fragments of papyrus, stone inscriptions, wax tablets. Each surviving document offers a small window into a world that vanished long ago. Archaeologists often describe history as a giant puzzle, with most of its pieces missing. Every discovery adds another fragment. Sometimes a single broken inscription changes what scholars believe about an entire city. Delos has provided thousands of such discoveries. Excavations began in the 19th century and continue even today. Beneath layers of earth and fallen stone, archaeologists uncovered houses, temples, shops, theaters, warehouses, streets, and marketplaces almost untouched for centuries. Unlike many ancient cities that remained continuously inhabited, Delos was eventually abandoned. That abandonment became a gift for historians. Without modern buildings covering the ruins, much of the ancient city survived beneath the soil. Walking through Delos today is like opening a history book made entirely of stone. The streets remain visible. Drainage channels still run beside them. Doorways mark the entrances to homes, whose owners disappeared more than 2,000 years ago. Even small details survive. Grooves worn into stone by wagon wheels. Steps polished smooth by countless sandals. Tiny shrines tucked into quiet corners where travelers once paused to offer silent prayers. History rarely survives in grand monuments alone. Often it survives in footprints, in worn thresholds, in the places where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. As Marcus watched another ship approach the harbor, he wondered where it had come from. Perhaps Egypt, perhaps Cyprus, perhaps Sicily. The captain would know. The cargo would tell its own story. Each amphora carried stamps identifying its workshop. Each bundle of cloth reflected the traditions of another region. Every object crossing the sea connected distant communities that might never meet face to face. The Mediterranean was not a barrier. It was a highway. Its blue waters linked cultures together in ways that changed history forever. As the afternoon breeze strengthened, hundreds of small waves sparkled beneath the sunlight. White gulls floated effortlessly above the harbor, occasionally diving toward the water before rising once again. Their graceful flight seemed unchanged from ancient times. Perhaps they had watched the first Greek settlers arrive. Perhaps their descendant circled above Roman merchants. And today, they still soar over the same coastline. Nature often changes far more slowly than civilization. Empires rise. Empires fall. Markets flourish. Markets disappear. Yet the sea continues its gentle rhythm, just as it always has. The waves that touched the harbor wall on a warm afternoon more than 2,000 years ago are gone. But new waves continue arriving, one after another, carrying the same quiet music that has echoed across Delos for thousands of years. And as the golden afternoon slowly moved toward evening, the island prepared once again for another peaceful sunset over the ancient Mediterranean. By the late afternoon, the brilliant white buildings of Delos had taken on a softer shade. The sunlight, now lower in the sky, no longer reflected with the sharp brightness of midday. Instead, everything seemed warmer, gentler. The marble temples glowed with hints of gold. The sea shimmered like polished bronze. Even the busiest streets appeared calmer than they had only a few hours before. This was the hour when the island seemed to breathe more slowly. Many of the day's largest business agreements had already been completed. Warehouse doors stood open, while workers carefully counted the remaining cargo. Accountants reviewed wax tablets one final time before storing them in wooden chests. Nothing was left to memory alone. In the Roman world, successful merchants understood the importance of careful records. A missing shipment, an incorrect payment, a forgotten agreement. Any one of these could damage a reputation built over decades. Reputation was, in many ways, a merchant's greatest treasure. Gold could be stolen. Ships could sink. Markets could change. But a trusted name opened doors throughout the Mediterranean. As one Roman writer later observed, a merchant's word often traveled farther than his ship. Near the northern edge of the harbor, an elderly mapmaker sat beneath a linen canopy. His workshop was small, but visitors stopped often to admire his work. He did not create maps in the modern sense. Ancient maps were rarely precise. Instead, they combined geography with the practical knowledge of experienced sailors. He carefully sketched coastlines, marked dangerous reefs, noted reliable harbors, added short observations beside important ports, fresh water available, safe anchorage in summer, strong northern winds. His maps were less about measuring distance and more about surviving the journey. Many captains added their own notes after returning from a voyage. In this way, knowledge slowly accumulated. One generation taught the next. A successful voyage rarely depended upon courage alone. It depended upon memory. Nearby, two young apprentices unloaded bundles of papyrus from Egypt. The tightly wrapped rolls were surprisingly valuable. Before paper existed, papyrus served as one of the Mediterranean's most important writing materials. It was made from the stems of the papyrus plant that grew along the Nile River. Craftsmen sliced the stems into thin strips. They laid the strips side by side. Another layer crossed them at right angles. The natural sap acted as a glue when pressed together. After drying, the sheets were polished smooth. The result was light, flexible, and easy to transport. Almost every contract, letter, official decree, and business record depended upon materials like these. Without papyrus, much of the Roman world's administration would have been impossible. Knowledge itself traveled aboard merchant ships. As the apprentices carried the precious bundles toward a nearby warehouse, they passed a group of children playing a simple game with smooth stones. Their laughter echoed through the narrow street. It was a reminder that daily life continued around the marketplace. Not everyone thought constantly about trade. Families still shared evening meals. Children still invented games. Neighbors still exchanged greetings. History often focuses on emperors, wars, and famous speeches. But most people spent their lives doing ordinary things. Preparing food, repairing tools, teaching children, visiting friends, watching sunsets. Those quiet moments made up the greater part of human history. As shadows lengthened across the city, the temples overlooking Delos became peaceful once again. The crowds of pilgrims had grown smaller. Priests quietly completed the final offerings of the day. Thin streams of fragrant smoke rose gently into the still evening air. For centuries, travelers arriving by sea had seen those temples before anything else. They stood high above the harbor, welcoming sailors long before they could distinguish individual buildings. To many, they represented safety, a successful journey, a place to rest before continuing across the Mediterranean. Even experienced captains admitted feeling relieved when the familiar outline of Delos appeared on the horizon after weeks at sea. The island offered more than commerce. It offered certainty, fresh water, food, repairs, shelter, reliable markets. These simple necessities made Delos invaluable. Far out across the harbor, the first fishing boats of the evening quietly pushed away from shore. Unlike large merchant ships, they moved with almost complete silence. Their oars dipped gently into the calm water. The fishermen knew that twilight often brought excellent catches. Patience mattered. The sea rewarded those willing to wait. That lesson extended beyond fishing. It described much of life in the ancient Mediterranean. Farmers waited for rain. Merchants waited for favorable winds. Sailors waited for clear skies. Stone masons waited for marble deliveries. Everyone depended, in one way or another, upon forces beyond their control. Perhaps that explains why ancient people often spoke so respectfully about fortune. Not fortune as money alone, but fortune as the unpredictable nature of life itself. Good harvests, safe voyages, healthy families, successful trade. None could be guaranteed. As the sky slowly shifted from bright blue to soft shades of amber and rose, the noise of the marketplace gradually faded. Wooden shutters closed one by one. Lanterns were prepared. The long business day was nearing its end. Tomorrow, before the first light touched the temples of Apollo, the harbor would awaken once again. New ships would arrive. Fresh stories would cross the sea. And Delos, small in size but immense in influence, would continue its quiet role at the heart of the ancient Mediterranean, one peaceful day at a time. The final light of the day lingered over the Aegean Sea. For a few quiet moments, the entire harbor seemed to glow. The water reflected shades of amber, copper, and deep crimson, while the white marble temples above the town slowly turned the color of warm honey. It was a scene that countless sailors had witnessed over the centuries. Many of them paused their work simply to watch. Even after a lifetime at sea, a Mediterranean sunset could still inspire silence. One by one, the shopkeepers lowered their wooden shutters. Heavy iron latches clicked softly into place. The day's business was finished. Coins had been counted. Contracts had been signed. Cargo had been recorded. Tomorrow, everything would begin again. That dependable rhythm gave Delos its strength. Unlike cities shaped by royal courts or military camps, Delos lived according to the sea. If the winds were favorable, the island prospered. If storms swept across the Aegean, the harbor grew quiet. Nature remained the invisible ruler of the marketplace. Near the waterfront, cooks prepared the evening meal. The aroma of roasting fish drifted through the streets, blending with the scent of fresh herbs, warm bread, garlic, and olive oil. Simple meals filled most tables. A loaf of bread torn by hand, a bowl of lentils, a handful of olives, perhaps a piece of goat cheese. For wealthier families, there might also be grilled fish seasoned with herbs gathered from the nearby hills. The Mediterranean diet of the ancient world was remarkably familiar in many ways. Fresh ingredients, seasonal produce, olive oil, grains, fish, fruit. Many of these traditions continue today. Children hurried home as darkness slowly settled over the island. Parents called to them from open doorways. Dogs barked briefly before curling up beside their owners. The noise of commerce gave way to the quieter sounds of family life. Lamps were lit inside homes, their small flames flickering behind woven curtains. From the hillside, the city resembled a field of tiny stars. In one modest house overlooking the harbor, a grandfather sat with his two grandchildren. As they shared their evening meal, the children asked him what Delos had been like when he was young. The old man smiled. It was quieter, he said. There were fewer warehouses, fewer ships, and many more pilgrims. He pointed toward the great sanctuary of Apollo. "When I was your age," he continued softly, "people spoke first about the temples. Now they speak first about the markets." The children listened carefully. To them, the busy harbor had always been part of life. They found it difficult to imagine the island any other way. History often changes so gradually that one generation hardly notices. Only those who live long enough to remember earlier times truly recognize the transformation. The grandfather had watched Delos become richer year after year. He had seen elegant new houses built with colorful mosaics. He had watched merchants arrive from places whose names he had never heard as a child. He had listened as more languages filled the streets. The island had not become larger, but somehow its world had. Outside, the evening breeze rustled the leaves of olive trees growing along the hillside. Beyond them, small vineyards stretched toward the rocky slopes. Although Delos depended heavily on imported goods, its people still cultivated what the island could provide. Fresh figs ripened beneath the warm summer sun. Goats grazed among the rocky hills. Bees collected nectar from wildflowers, producing fragrant honey prized by local families. Life on Delos balanced local traditions with international commerce. It was both an island village and a global marketplace. This unique combination made it unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient Mediterranean. Far below, the harbor remained active. Not with the hurried movement of daytime, but with quieter preparation. A crew checked ropes before an early departure. Another captain studied the stars, planning tomorrow's route toward Rhodes. Experienced sailors preferred leaving before sunrise, when the morning winds were often gentler. Every voyage required careful planning. Distance alone never determined the journey. Currents mattered. Seasonal winds mattered. Safe harbors mattered. A wise captain knew when not to sail. Patience frequently saved lives. As darkness deepened, the constellation of Orion slowly rose above the eastern horizon. During certain seasons, ancient sailors used its bright stars to help guide their course. The heavens served as a map long before compasses became common. Each familiar constellation reminded travelers that, although the sea was vast, they were never entirely without direction. Somewhere in the quiet harbor, a flute began to play. Its melody drifted softly across the still water. No audience gathered. No grand performance was taking place. Someone was simply playing for the pleasure of music. The gentle notes floated between the anchored ships before disappearing into the night. It was the kind of moment that history rarely records. No ancient writer described it. No inscription preserved it. Yet moments like these filled the lives of ordinary people. A fisherman humming while repairing his nets. A child laughing in a narrow street. A baker greeting his first customer before dawn. A sailor watching the stars from the deck of his ship. These quiet moments formed the true rhythm of ancient life. And perhaps that is why Delos continues to fascinate historians today. Not simply because it was wealthy. Not because it stood at the center of Mediterranean trade. But because beneath all of its commerce, politics, and ambition, it remained a place where ordinary people lived ordinary days. One peaceful sunrise, one busy marketplace, and one quiet evening at a time. The island slept once more beneath a sky crowded with stars, while beyond the horizon, unseen ships continued their slow journey toward the harbor, carrying tomorrow's stories across the calm waters of the ancient sea. Part 3. The first birds awoke long before the merchants. Their gentle calls echoed across the rocky hills of Delos as darkness slowly gave way to another peaceful morning. The stars faded one by one. A thin band of pale gold appeared above the eastern horizon. The sea, which had looked almost black only moments earlier, gradually became deep blue once again. It was a quiet transformation, so gradual that anyone watching might not notice exactly when night became day. For the people of Delos, this gentle beginning marked the start of another ordinary day. For us, more than 2,000 years later, it offers a chance to step into a world that no longer exists. A world where nearly every journey depended on the wind, where news traveled by sail instead of signal, where the rhythm of life followed the seasons, the sea, and the rising sun. As dawn spread across the island, the sanctuary of Apollo caught the first light. Its marble columns glowed softly against the cool morning sky. For centuries, travelers approaching Delos had recognized those temples from far out at sea. They stood as landmarks long before the harbor came into view. To weary sailors, the sight brought reassurance. It meant fresh water, safe anchorage, food, trade, and perhaps most importantly, familiar ground beneath their feet. The island itself was not large. Modern visitors are often surprised by its size. You can walk across much of Delos in just a few hours. Yet its influence during the 2nd century BC reached far beyond its rocky shoreline. Sometimes, history gathers in surprisingly small places. Not because they are rich in natural resources, not because they are large, but because geography places them exactly where people need them most. Delos was one of those rare places. Positioned near the center of the Aegean Sea, it became a crossroads connecting east and west. Ships from Egypt sailed north. Vessels from Greece headed south. Merchants traveling between Italy and Asia Minor often passed nearby. The island naturally became a meeting place. And wherever people meet, stories begin. The harbor slowly came to life. A fisherman pushed his narrow boat into the calm water with hardly a sound. He paused for a moment before climbing aboard, looking toward the brightening horizon. The weather seemed promising. Only a few thin clouds floated high above the sea. The breeze remained gentle. Good conditions. He smiled quietly. After so many years on the water, he had learned not to expect perfection. Only opportunity. His father had taught him something many decades earlier. The sea owes us nothing, he had said. It simply offers us a chance. Those words stayed with him throughout his life. Perhaps they reflected more than fishing. Perhaps they described the ancient world itself. Life rarely offered certainty. Only possibility. Along the waterfront, bakers were already hard at work. Large clay ovens had been heated before dawn. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the cool air, inviting early customers from every direction. Bread was more than food. It was the foundation of daily life. Nearly every household purchased it. Some baked their own. Others relied on neighborhood bakeries that had served the same streets for generations. The first customers arrived carrying woven baskets beneath their arms. They greeted the baker warmly. No hurry. No impatience. There was comfort in familiar routines. The baker knew many of them by name. He remembered who preferred darker barley bread, who always bought 2 loaves instead of 1, who liked an extra handful of herbs baked into the crust. Small details built lasting friendships. Nearby, a young apprentice carefully swept the stone floor outside his master's shop. The workshop specialized in bronze lamps. Inside, rows of finished lamps rested upon wooden shelves, each one polished until it reflected the morning light. Some would remain on Delos. Others would travel hundreds of miles aboard merchant ships. Ancient trade spread not only necessities, but also craftsmanship. A beautifully made object carried the reputation of its maker across the Mediterranean. The apprentice hoped that one day people would recognize his own work. For now he watched. He listened. He learned. Skill came slowly. Patience remained the first lesson. Across the harbor, several merchant captains gathered near a stone fountain. They filled clay jars with fresh water before preparing for another voyage. One captain planned to sail toward Rhodes. Another hoped to reach Corinth. A third intended to cross the open sea toward the western coast of Italy. Each route presented different challenges, different weather, different opportunities. The Mediterranean connected civilizations, but it never promised an easy journey. Every departure required courage balanced by experience. As the sun rose a little higher, its light reached the busiest part of Delos, the great harbor itself. Dozens of ships rested side by side. Some carried colorful painted eyes upon their bows. Ancient sailors believed these eyes allowed a ship to see dangers hidden beneath the water. Whether symbolic or superstitious, the tradition was widespread throughout the Mediterranean. Even practical people often welcomed a little extra luck. Life at sea encouraged humility. No captain, however skilled, controlled the wind. No merchant, however wealthy, could command the weather. Nature remained the greatest force in the ancient world. The harbor echoed with quiet industry. Ropes tightened. Wood creaked gently. Seagulls circled overhead. Dockworkers exchanged calm greetings as another beautiful day began. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing needed to. History is not built only by battles and emperors. More often, it is built by ordinary mornings like this one. A fisherman casting his net. A baker opening his oven. A merchant checking his ledger. A sailor studying the wind. Together, their quiet routines shaped an entire civilization. And as the golden morning spread across the island of Delos, another peaceful day began at one of the most remarkable crossroads of the ancient world. As the sun climbed steadily above the eastern horizon, its warm light spread across every corner of the island. The marble temples reflected the morning glow with quiet elegance. The narrow streets, still cool from the night, gradually filled with footsteps. Shopkeepers lifted wooden shutters. Craftsmen unlocked their workshops. The peaceful silence of dawn slowly transformed into the gentle rhythm of another working day. Nothing felt hurried. The people of Delos had learned to work with the pace of the Mediterranean rather than against it. Summer mornings were precious. The cooler air allowed heavy work to be completed before the strongest heat arrived. By noon, even the most energetic laborers would welcome the shade of stone buildings. Near the waterfront, two young brothers carried baskets of freshly picked figs toward the marketplace. Their family's small orchard lay on a neighboring island. Before sunrise, they had crossed the calm water in a modest fishing boat, arriving just as the harbor was waking. The figs were carefully arranged, inside woven baskets lined with soft leaves to prevent bruising. Fresh fruit was always popular. Travelers appreciated simple food that required no preparation. Sailors often purchased figs before beginning a long voyage. The fruit lasted well for several days and provided welcome sweetness during life at sea. As the brothers found their usual place in the market, familiar faces greeted them with friendly smiles. Business was important. Community was equally important. Many merchants had known one another for years. Some had watched each other's children grow into apprentices. Others had weathered difficult seasons together, when storms delayed ships and trade slowed to almost nothing. Prosperity made friendships pleasant. Hardship often made them stronger. Across the square, an elderly potter inspected a row of newly fired clay bowls. Each piece had been shaped by hand. No two were perfectly identical. That was part of their charm. Ancient craftsmanship valued skill rather than absolute uniformity. The potter ran his fingers gently along the rim of one bowl, searching for tiny cracks. Finding none, he smiled quietly. Another successful firing. Another day's work completed with care. His workshop had belonged to his father before him, and to his grandfather before that. 3 generations had shaped clay from the same hillside. 3 generations had sold their work in the same marketplace. History often feels distant. Yet for the people living it, life moved through familiar routines passed from one generation to the next. Nearby, the sound of chisels echoed from a stone workshop. Several masons were carving decorative columns, destined for a wealthy merchant's new house. The marble had arrived only weeks earlier from the nearby island of Paros, famous throughout the ancient world for producing exceptionally fine white stone. Parian marble was prized by sculptors because of its purity and smooth texture. Some of the greatest statues of ancient Greece were carved from it. Every block represented months of difficult labor. Workers in the quarries cut enormous sections from the mountainside using iron tools, wooden wedges, and remarkable patience. The heavy stone was then transported by ship across the Aegean. Only after surviving that journey did the real artistry begin. The master mason studied the surface carefully before making each cut. He knew there could be no haste. One careless strike might ruin weeks of work. Patience, he often reminded his apprentices, was as important as strength. The island itself reflected that lesson. Nothing on Delos had appeared overnight. The magnificent temples had taken decades to complete. The elegant houses overlooking the harbor had grown gradually as families became wealthier. Even the harbor, with its long stone quays and busy warehouses, represented generations of careful planning. History rarely arrives all at once. It is built one day at a time. One stone, one journey, one decision, one sunrise after another. As the marketplace grew busier, the aromas of the morning blended together. Fresh bread, olive oil, crushed herbs, honey, salt from the sea, warm wood, the faint scent of pine resin drifting from the shipyards. Travelers often remembered cities by their smells as much as by their appearance. Each harbor possessed its own unique mixture of scents carried by the wind. Delos smelled of commerce, of the sea, of fresh stone warmed by the sun, and of countless goods arriving from distant shores. Beyond the market, a teacher gathered a small group of children beneath the shade of a covered walkway. Their lessons had already begun. Using a wax tablet, he carefully traced Greek letters while the children repeated each sound aloud. Education in the ancient world varied greatly. Some children received years of instruction. Others learned only practical skills within their family's trade. Many never attended formal lessons at all. Knowledge was valuable, but opportunity often depended upon wealth. Even so, parents who could afford education usually viewed it as one of the greatest gifts they could offer. Reading, writing, arithmetic. These skills opened doors throughout the Mediterranean. A merchant who could calculate accounts accurately possessed an enormous advantage. A scribe with beautiful handwriting rarely lacked work. An educated navigator could guide ships safely across unfamiliar waters. Learning was an investment whose value often lasted a lifetime. As another peaceful morning unfolded, Delos continued to reveal its many faces. It was a sacred island, a bustling marketplace, a busy harbor, a center of craftsmanship, a crossroads of cultures. Each street held a different story. Each doorway opened into another ordinary life. And together, those quiet lives created one of the most remarkable communities in the ancient Mediterranean, where every sunrise brought new arrivals, new opportunities, and another calm chapter in the long story of history. As the morning approached its busiest hour, the sunlight reflected brilliantly across the harbor. From the top of a nearby hillside, the masts of dozens of ships looked almost like a small forest of wooden poles rising from the water. Each vessel had arrived from a different place. Each carried its own story. Some had crossed only a short stretch of the Aegean Sea. Others had traveled hundreds of miles, following coastlines that curved through Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, and Italy. The Mediterranean was often called Mare Nostrum, our sea, by the Romans. To them, it was not a barrier separating civilizations. It was the road that connected them. A merchant could leave Alexandria with a cargo of grain, stop at Delos, continue to Corinth, and eventually sail onward to Italy. Every harbor became another chapter in the journey. Near the eastern quay, a young sailor carefully coiled a long hemp rope. It was work that demanded patience more than strength. A tangled rope could become dangerous during a sudden storm. His captain had taught him never to rush simple tasks. "The sea remembers carelessness," he often said. The young sailor smiled as he repeated the words quietly to himself. He had heard them countless times. Yet every voyage proved them true. Across the harbor, another crew was repairing a large square sail. Months of constant wind had worn small tears through the heavy linen fabric. Several sailors sat together beneath the shade of the mast, passing large bronze needles from hand to hand as they stitched the cloth. Their conversation wandered easily between memories of distant ports. One remembered the towering lighthouse of Alexandria, whose fire guided ships from many miles away. Another spoke of Rhodes and its busy markets. A third described the green hills of Sicily after the winter rains. Each voyage added another memory, another coastline, another story to tell. For experienced sailors, the Mediterranean became less a collection of separate countries and more a single familiar world. They recognized mountains long before cities appeared. They knew where fresh water could be found. They remembered which harbors offered safe shelter during autumn storms. Knowledge accumulated slowly, voyage after voyage. No classroom could teach what years at sea eventually revealed. Along the stone promenade beside the harbor, philosophers occasionally gathered to debate ideas while watching ships arrive. To modern ears, it might seem surprising that discussions about ethics, mathematics, and astronomy took place only a short walk from busy warehouses. But the ancient world often blended practical life with intellectual curiosity. Trade carried ideas just as surely as it carried cargo. A traveler might arrive with spices from Arabia, and at the same time, share news of a new mathematical theory from Alexandria. Knowledge crossed the sea alongside merchandise. One elderly scholar pointed toward the sky as he explained how sailors used the position of the sun to estimate direction during the day. Although ancient navigation lacked the precision of modern instruments, experienced captains combined careful observation with remarkable memory. They studied seasonal winds, the movement of stars, the shape of coastlines. Even the color of the water could reveal hidden shoals or changes in depth. The Mediterranean rewarded those who paid attention. Nearby, a group of children paused to watch a flock of gulls circling above a fishing boat returning with its morning catch. The birds knew exactly when fishermen were likely to clean their nets. They waited patiently for scraps. One brave gull swooped low, snatching a tiny fish before soaring effortlessly back into the bright blue sky. The children laughed. The fisherman pretended to scold the bird. Everyone seemed to enjoy the familiar little performance. Moments like these rarely appear in history books. Yet they remind us that ancient people smiled. They joked. They paused to watch birds. They admired beautiful mornings. In many ways, they were not so different from us. By late morning, the marketplace had become wonderfully colorful. Deep purple figs rested beside bright green olives. Bundles of fragrant herbs filled woven baskets. Dyed fabrics from the eastern Mediterranean fluttered gently in the breeze, rich blues, warm reds, golden yellows, and soft creams. Bronze lamps caught the sunlight. Freshly polished pottery reflected tiny flashes of light. Even the simple clay amphory lining, the streets created patterns of warm earth tones against the white stone buildings. Delos was a place of movement, but it was also a place of remarkable beauty. Today, when visitors walk among its ruins, they often find only weathered marble, broken columns, and quiet pathways. It requires imagination to picture the island as it once was. The streets were alive. Walls were painted in vivid colors. Markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world. Voices echoed in many languages. The harbor was crowded with sails from dawn until dusk. Archaeology allows us to recover pieces of that world, but never all of it. Some sounds have vanished forever. Some faces were never recorded. Some stories disappeared with the people who lived them. Perhaps that is why walking through Delos today feels so moving. The silence invites us to imagine the lives that once filled these empty streets. And as another gentle breeze drifted across the harbor, carrying the scent of salt and sun-warmed stone, the island continued its timeless rhythm, welcoming travelers, exchanging ideas, and quietly connecting civilizations across the ancient Mediterranean. Part 3 continues.